In the wind-burnt hills above Perdition Creek, folks whispered that the devil came to collect debts, but what happened to El Ravane was a whisper that turned into a scream. They said her baby was born without a single breath, buried in a box without a name. The preacher gave a prayer he didn't mean. The town gave its pity, which was cheaper than courage. And Elra, she gave up her voice, sealing her grief inside where it couldn't get out. For 6 long months the silence held. Then a drifter rode in, dusty, quiet, and haunted by things the dust couldn't cover. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was just looking for the end of the road. But one look into El Ravane's eyes, and he knew. He knew the baby wasn't dead. Not yet. And if he didn't move fast, the whole town would make damn sure she stayed that way. Perdition Creek wasn't a town you found on a map. It was a scar the world had forgotten to heal. Dust hung in the air like a final judgment, slow and inescapable, coating everything in a fine red powder of regret. The people there had learned to speak in shadows, in quick glances, in doors that shut a little too fast. They called it a quiet town. But there's a difference between quiet and peace. Sometimes quiet is just the sound of a scream holding its breath. And El Ravane lived at the very edge of that silence. Her shack leaned against the old chapel, right where the graveyard began, and the trees grew twisted, like they were trying to crawl away from the cursed earth. She wore her grief like armor, her hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, and she walked like she was afraid the ground might remember her and open up. They said she used to sing, said her voice could make the chapel windows tremble. But that was before the day the town doctor walked out of her shack, his face pale, his hat in his hands, mumbling the 2 words that killed her world. Stillborn. They buried the empty box fast. No marker, no name. Just a mound of dirt that the wind was already trying to flatten. Elra didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just sat in the front pew of the chapel until the last candle flickered and died, as if she was waiting for God himself to walk down the aisle and explain the mistake. The town did what towns do. It moved on. The women left pies on her porch that rotted in the sun. The men tipped their hats, but found reasons to cross the street. The preacher came by twice, clutching a Bible she wouldn't look at, and then he stopped coming too. They all agreed it was a terrible tragedy. The kind you talk about once, then bury deep so you don't have to feel it. So they buried it, until the drifter came. He rode in on a horse the color of dirty gold, his saddle worn smooth with miles and secrets. His name, if he had one, got lost on the wind. Nobody bothered to ask. Men like him were like mirages in the heat. You look too long, you might see something you don't want to. He walked into the saloon, dropped a coin on the bar, and took a table in the darkest corner, where the light couldn't find his eyes. But even from the shadows, you could feel him, watching, measuring, like he could see the ghosts that everyone else pretended weren't there. It was his second night in town that he saw her. Elra. She was just fetching water from the town well, a chore so simple it shouldn't feel like walking to your own execution. She kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the dirt in front of her feet. But as she passed the saloon's grimy window, the drifter stood up. Not fast, not loud, but something in the way he moved, the way his spine went rigid. It was like he'd been struck by lightning. He left his drink on the table and walked out onto the porch. The wind was kicking up, making the dust dance around her ankles like hungry spirits. He just watched her walk. He saw the story in the rigid line of her back, in the slight tremble of her wrist as she held the bucket. He'd seen grief before. He knew its shape, its smell. But this was different. This wasn't grief. This was a cage. She wasn't mourning a loss. She was guarding a secret. He didn't follow her. He didn't speak. He just watched the way she flinched at shadows, the way her free hand would sometimes drift to her stomach, empty, but still remembering the weight. He sat on the edge of town all night, his hat pulled low, just staring at the crooked fence of the chapel graveyard. And when the wind shifted just right, he could have sworn he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Faint, impossibly faint, like a baby's cry, smothered by 6 feet of dirt and lies. By morning, he was in the general store, asking questions a man with no name had no business asking. What happened to the Vane child? Who was the doctor? Why isn't there a gravestone? The storekeeper just shrugged. The sheriff told him it was none of his concern. But one old man, sitting by the cracker barrel, muttered something under his breath. Said the preacher was in a mighty big hurry with that shovel. Said it wasn't natural. The drifter didn't push. He just listened, letting the pieces of the town's silence click together in his mind. But it was the undertaker who finally broke. A small, nervous man who smelled of formaldehyde and fear. The drifter found him in his workshop, planing a coffin lid. He didn't have to say a word. The undertaker looked up, saw his eyes, and started talking. I never buried no baby that week, he whispered, not looking up from the wood. Preacher came to me, asked for a small box. I made it, but he never came to collect it. Asked him about it twice. He just said it was handled privately. The undertaker finally looked up, his own eyes wide with the terror he'd been holding for 6 months. Nothing about it felt right. Nothing. The drifter just gave one slow nod. The kind of nod a man gives when a nightmare he's been having his whole life finally steps out of the dark and shows him its face. That evening, he walked out to the graveyard. He found the patch of earth the preacher had pointed to, the one the whole town avoided. The ground was hard, unbroken. The weeds were old and brittle. There was no sign of a shovel ever touching that soil. Just a single crooked nail hammered into the fence post nearby, a nail that looked far too new. He stared at that patch of dirt for a very long time. Then he walked to Elra's door. She didn't answer his knock. She didn't have to. She knew he was there. She could feel him through the wood, a low thunder that rattled her bones. When she finally pulled the door open, her eyes weren't just sad. They were wild. The eyes of an animal caught in a trap, ready to chew its own leg off to get free. He didn't tip his hat. He didn't say her name. He just looked straight through her and said the 2 words that changed everything. They lied. Her bottom lip trembled, just once. A crack in the dam. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small folded piece of cloth. Inside was a single, hand-carved wooden bead, the paint worn off from tiny gums. He'd found it snagged on that new nail in the fence. A sign, a prayer, a clue. Elra stared at it like it was the holiest thing she'd ever seen, a ghost of a memory. They told you she didn't breathe, the drifter said, his voice low and rough. But somebody took her, and I think you already knew that, didn't you? Elra Vane, the woman who hadn't spoken in half a year, couldn't find the words, but she didn't need them. She gave him a single violent nod, and in that one small movement, a war began. Someone in this godforsaken town had stolen a child, and the men who buried the lie were still walking around, breathing free air. That was about to change. The sun rose over Perdition Creek like a bleeding wound, trying to cauterize the sins of the town below. But some wounds can't be fixed with pretty light. A child was alive somewhere, traded for a secret, and her mother had been left to rot in a prison of silence. The drifter didn't need Elra to speak. That one broken nod was a confession, a map, and a declaration of war all rolled into one. It meant she remembered hearing that one single cry before they ripped the baby from her arms. It meant she knew the preacher's comforting words were just the bars of her cage. The drifter left her on the porch, clutching that wooden bead, and walked toward the center of town. He started with the doctor. Doc Emery was an old man held together by whiskey and regret, the kind of man who had delivered enough life and signed enough death certificates to see them as two sides of the same tarnished coin. The drifter didn't knock. He just walked into the clinic. The doc looked up from the flask he was polishing. "Got a sickness, stranger?" he rasped. "I'm looking for a cure," the drifter replied, his voice flat. "For a lie. 6 months old." The doc's hand froze. He knew. "This is about the Vane girl." It wasn't a question. The drifter just stared, letting the silence do the work. Doc Emery finally broke, the air hissing out of him like a punctured lung. "I didn't want any part of it," he stammered, his eyes darting towards the door. "They called me in late, said the girl was fading, the baby was already gone. But when I got there, the preacher was already holding it, a bundle of cloth, told me it was stillborn, told me to sign the certificate and keep my mouth shut for the good of the town." The drifter's eyes narrowed into slits. "Did you see the child?" The doctor hesitated, a flicker of something, shame maybe in his eyes. "No, just the cloth. But it felt wrong, too light, no blood, no smell of birth." He took a shaky gulp of whiskey. "The preacher was there, and the sheriff. The sheriff's the one who said it. It's for the best." He said it over and over again. "It's for the best." The drifter felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. This wasn't just a kidnapping, it was a conspiracy. The town's holy man and its lawmen had traded a newborn baby for what? For peace? For profit? What could possibly make a child so dangerous they had to erase her from the world? He left the clinic without another word and headed straight for the chapel. Reverend Malden was in his study, surrounded by books that spoke of God and mercy, things he clearly knew nothing about. He looked up when the drifter entered, his face a calm, practiced mask. "Have you come to confess your sins, my son?" "Not mine," the drifter said, his boots loud on the old floorboards. "I came to hear you confess yours. What did you do with El Ravain's baby?" The preacher didn't even blink. He gave a sad, pious smile. "That poor child was taken by the Lord. A stillbirth is a terrible—" "Stop!" The drifter's voice was suddenly a low growl, the sound of rocks grinding together deep underground. "God didn't take her. You did." The smile vanished from Malden's face. He stood up, trying to use his height, his position, to intimidate. "You are speaking blasphemy. You don't know what you're saying." "I know you buried a box full of rocks," the drifter shot back, taking a step closer. "I know you stood over a grieving mother and fed her poison with a silver spoon. And I know there's a little girl out there somewhere with Elra's eyes and a name she's never been allowed to hear." The preacher's composure finally cracked. A tremor ran through his hands. "Even if it were true, what could you possibly do? You're one man. Are you going to burn the whole town to the ground?" The drifter's silence was more terrifying than any threat. Malden collapsed back into his chair, the mask gone, revealing the weak, terrified man beneath. "I was told to do it," he whispered, the words tumbling out. "To protect her, to protect the town. The orders came from a man you don't say no to. He said the child was his property. Said if Elra tried to keep her, there would be a river of blood through this valley." "Whose name?" the drifter demanded, his voice like iron. The Reverend's mouth twisted, as if the name itself was acid. "Halloran. Brand Halloran." The name hit the air and hung there, heavy and cold. The drifter's jaw tightened so hard a muscle jumped. Brand Halloran. The name was a curse whispered in 3 counties. A cattle baron who bought and sold everything that wasn't nailed down. And if it was, he'd buy the nails too. Land, judges, laws, people. They had a contract, the the preacher choked out, his face slick with sweat. Her father, he was a fool, owed Halloran a debt he couldn't pay. He signed her away before she was even born. The drifter turned and walked out, the preacher's confession still echoing in the holy silence. He didn't run. He walked to his horse with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had just been given a destination. He saddled the mare, his movements economical and precise. He rode to the edge of Perdition Creek and stared down the long, dusty trail that led south. The wind blew strange, carrying whispers of a crime far older and uglier than he had imagined. Somewhere down that trail, a little girl was being raised as livestock. And back in a shack by a crooked graveyard, a mother was standing in her doorway watching him. Still silent, still waiting. The drifter tipped his hat, a single solemn gesture. Then he turned his horse south, toward Brand Halloran, toward the reckoning. The trail south was a cruel, winding thing, a scar carved through hills that God had long since abandoned. The drifter rode with the dry wind as his only companion, whispering through the sagebrush and past the sun-bleached bones of things that hadn't been fast enough. Every single hoofbeat on the baked earth was a hammer blow, forging a promise. Not to Elra, not even to the child he'd never met. It was a promise to a piece of himself he thought he'd buried long ago. Some men are made by the law, some are made by the Bible. He had been made by the silence that comes after a great injustice, and he was fluent in its language. Bran Halloran's name was a sickness in the air. You heard it in the saloons, where men drank to forget what they'd done for his money. You saw it in the county courthouse, in the eyes of judges who knew which way the scales were weighted. Cattle king, land thief, a man who owned more souls than the devil himself. And if the preacher was telling the truth, he had added a baby girl to his vast and terrible inventory. The drifter didn't ride fast. He rode with a burning certainty, a slow, methodical anger that was more dangerous than any quick temper. As dusk fell on the first day, he came upon a place called Bray Hollow. It wasn't much of a town, just a handful of buildings leaning on each other for support, too tired to fall down. He tied his horse outside the saloon and pushed through the swinging doors, letting the familiar smell of stale beer and desperation wash over him. A stranger walking in was an event. Every eye in the place found him, measured him, dismissed him. He walked to the bar. "I'm looking for Halloran's Ridge," he said to the barkeep, his voice low. The barkeep was a man whose face looked like a poorly folded map. He squinted. "That ridge ain't for sightseers. What business you got with Bran Halloran?" "Family business," the drifter said. The barkeep grunted. In these parts, that could mean anything, and it was best not to ask. He poured a shot of rye and slid it across the splintered wood. 3 days south. Can't miss it. Just follow the fences. More barbed wire than God ever intended for one man to own. The drifter downed the rye in one gulp, the burn a familiar friend. He turned, his eyes sweeping the room. In the corner, 2 men were pretending to play cards, but their eyes were on him. One of them leaned and whispered to the other. The drifter didn't wait to see what they decided. He walked out. They followed him, their boots heavy on the boardwalk. "You lost, friend," one of them called out as he reached his horse. The drifter didn't turn around, just slowly started to untie the reins. "No. This ain't your road," the second one said, his voice harder now. "Whatever family business you think you got, you should turn around and ride north. Forget you ever heard the name Halloran." The drifter finally turned to face them. His eyes were tired, ancient. There was no fear in them, just a profound weariness and a deep, cold well of anger. "I ain't asking for directions." The first man was fast, his hand blurred towards his hip, but the drifter didn't go for his gun. He exploded forward, a blur of motion, and brought the heavy leather reins down like a whip across the man's gun hand. There was a sickening crack of bone. The man screamed. The second one managed to clear his holster, but the drifter was already on him, batting the gun barrel aside with one hand and smashing the butt of his own pistol into the man's temple. 2 men down in as many seconds. 2 quiet heaps in the dust. He didn't even look at them as he mounted his horse and rode on. The second day, the wind turned colder, coming off the high rocks with a venomous bite. He watered his horse at a hidden spring and stared up at the vast, empty sky. A feeling of wrongness settled over him, the kind of deep quiet that comes before an earthquake. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath. That night his sleep was shallow, filled with fractured dreams. He saw Elra, her face streaked with tears, holding a child with no face. He saw a sprawling ranch house consumed by flames. He heard Bran Holloran's voice, a sound like rust and gravel, calling out a girl's name, a name that wasn't hers. He woke up with his gun in his hand, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, the dream still clinging to him like a shroud. By the afternoon of the third day, he saw it. The fence line. It started abruptly, a vicious gash of barbed wire and cedar posts stretching as far as the eye could see in either direction. Holloran's Ridge. It wasn't a ranch. It was a kingdom built on stolen land and broken wills. Cattle dotted the landscape, but it was the buildings that told the real story. A main house big enough to cast a shadow over the entire valley, barns and outbuildings, and a long, low structure that looked for all the world like a schoolhouse. He knew it wasn't for the local children. It was for the ones who had been collected. He watched from the ridge for an hour, his spyglass trained on the compound. He saw ranch hands moving with the slumped shoulders of prisoners. He saw the children. They lined up to carry buckets of water from a well, a silent single file of them. And then he saw her, a girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with tangled brown hair. She was small for her age, but when a younger boy stumbled and dropped his bucket, she didn't hesitate. She put down her own and helped him, her small face set with a grim determination. Then an overseer shouted, and she turned. She didn't flinch. She just stared at him with a defiance that was older than her years. She had Elra's spine. A cold fire spread through the drifter's veins. He nudged his horse and started down the ridge. The main gate was manned by 2 men who were not cowboys. They were enforcers, dressed in black vests, their guns worn high and clean. "State your business," one of them said, his hand resting on his pistol. The drifter swung down from his horse. "I'm here to see Bran Holloran. He ain't expecting you. Tell him a ghost is here to see him." The guard snorted, but there was something in the drifter's dead-eyed stare that made him reconsider. He sent a boy running toward the main house. A few minutes later, the boy returned. "The boss'll see you, but you leave your irons here." The drifter just looked at him, then started walking through the gate, his rifle still on his back, his pistol still holstered. The boy swallowed hard. "I said, no guns." "I heard you," the drifter said without breaking stride. Brand Holloran was waiting on the porch of a pristine white house. He was a big man, his wealth apparent in the softness of his hands and the expensive linen stretched tight across his belly. "So," Holloran said, a cruel smile playing on his lips, "you're the one who's been digging up old graves." The drifter stopped at the bottom of the steps. "I'm the one pulling the living out of them." Holloran laughed, a deep, ugly sound. "There's always another righteous fool riding out of the desert, isn't there? Let me save you some time. That girl isn't yours. She isn't even her mother's anymore. She's an asset, bought and paid for." The drifter's eyes moved past him into the house. He saw imported rugs, a grand piano, shelves lined with leather-bound books. The kind of comfort that is paid for with the misery of others. You can buy cattle, you can buy land, you don't buy a person's blood. Halloran's smile finally vanished. What is it you want? Her. She doesn't even have a name you'd recognize. She doesn't know who you are. She knows who she isn't. Halloran poured himself a glass of whiskey from a decanter on the porch rail. I have the law in my pocket in 4 counties. I have 100 men on my payroll. Do you really think you can just walk in here and take what is mine? The drifter looked the big man dead in the eye, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't come here to walk. He turned his back on Halloran and walked away. That night, under the cold, unblinking eyes of the stars, the schoolhouse caught fire. The flames rose into the night sky like a roaring beast, a beautiful, terrible orange against the black. Panic erupted. Guards ran, shouting, their attention fixed on the blaze. In the chaos, the children scattered like startled quail. The drifter moved through the smoke and confusion like a phantom. He found her behind the stables, her arms wrapped protectively around a younger boy. She looked up at him, her face smudged with soot, her eyes wide. He knelt down in front of her. Your name is Mercy, he said softly. Her eyes flickered with confusion. Who are you? I'm a friend of your mother's. She didn't ask another question. She just took his outstretched hand. In the distance, gunshots finally began to ring out as Halloran's men realized what was happening. 3 of them went down before they even saw the shadow they were shooting at. The rest, fools that they were, rode toward the fire, chasing ghosts. The drifter lifted Mercy onto his horse, swung up behind her, and rode north. The flames of Brand Halloran's stolen kingdom painted the horizon behind them. And for the first time in a very long time, the drifter felt something that might have been a smile. The stars over the plains were cold and sharp, like chips of ice scattered on black velvet. The wind had shifted, and now it carried the acrid smell of burning pine and something else, something heavier, the smell of a rich man's fury turning to ash. Halloran's empire wasn't destroyed, not by a long shot, but a crack had appeared in its foundation, and the silence that rushed in to fill the space left by the fire was louder and more dangerous than any gunshot. The drifter rode hard, not stopping until the first pale light of dawn began to bleed across the eastern hills, turning the sky the color of a fresh bruise. Mercy was a small, warm weight behind him, her arms wrapped tight around his waist. She was silent, but he could feel the tremors running through her small body. Her fingers were clenched in the thick fabric of his duster, holding on like it was the only real thing in a world that had just dissolved into smoke and shadow. He kept glancing over his shoulder, scanning the dark horizon behind them. He didn't expect Halloran's men to give up. Men like Brand Halloran didn't see children. They saw property, investments, leverage. And he had just stolen a prize asset. By dawn, he found them a place to hide, a rocky outcropping overlooking a dry creek bed, a place so barren and forgotten it felt safe. An old trapper's lean-to, long abandoned, offered just enough cover. He helped Mercy down from the horse, her legs unsteady, and built a tiny, smokeless fire from twigs and dry grass, just enough to fight off the pre-dawn chill. She hadn't said a word since he'd pulled her from the chaos. He tore off a piece of jerky and handed it to her. She took it, stared at it for a long moment. Then her eyes lifted to his. Is my mama dead? Her voice was so small, it was almost part of the wind. The drifter didn't answer right away. He wouldn't give her an easy lie, not after she'd been living one her whole life. She thought you were, he said finally, his gaze fixed on the small flames. They told her you were, but a part of her never believed it. It was like a ghost she kept hearing in the walls. That's why I came looking, to see if the ghost was real. Mercy's brow furrowed. Why? Why would they say I died? He poked the fire with a stick, watching the embers dance. Because a lie like that is a chain. A broken person doesn't fight back. They keep people quiet, scared, obedient. He looked at her then, his eyes holding hers. And because your real name is worth more than this whole damn valley. She chewed the jerky slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. She was studying him, piecing him together. "What's your name?" she asked. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. "I've had more than a few. Most of them I'd just as soon forget. You can call me whatever you like." She thought for a moment. "I'll call you Smoke," she said, her voice certain. He raised an eyebrow. "Smoke, because you came from the fire," she said, her logic simple and devastating. "And you move without making a sound." He gave a single, slow nod. Smoke. It fit better than most. They stayed hidden for the rest of the day. He spread his bedroll to give them some shade from the relentless sun, and spent the afternoon stitching a tear in his saddlebag with a needle and thread he kept for such occasions. Mercy eventually fell asleep, curled up near the dead fire like a stray kitten, exhausted by a terror her young mind was still trying to process. He didn't sleep. He watched the horizon. Around mid-afternoon, he saw it. Dust. 5 riders moving in a practiced sweep across the hills. They weren't searching randomly. They were hunters following a trail. Smoke kicked dirt over the last of the embers, gently roused Mercy with a hand on her shoulder, and had them moving again in under a minute. He abandoned the trails, leading the horse through narrow gulches and over rocky ridges where their tracks would be harder to follow. Mercy held on without a word of complaint. She was watching him, her eyes absorbing his every move. She saw how he listened to the wind, how he read the signs in the bent grass and the disturbed stones. She was learning. They reached the ghost town of Veston's End as the last light faded from the sky. It was a skeleton of a town, buildings slumping like tired old men, their windows like vacant eyes. The church steeple had been snapped in half by lightning or time, a broken finger pointing at the heavens. He found them shelter in the old general store. The roof was mostly there, and a back room was still dry and free of drafts. He built another small fire on the stone floor, using wood from the shattered shelves. As the fire crackled to life, Mercy ran her small fingers over the faded script in an old, dust-covered ledger book left on the counter. "What was this place?" she whispered. "Hope, for a while," Smoke said, staring into the flames. "Then greed, then nothing." She seemed to understand. She curled up on an old grain sack, her head pillowed on her arm, and was asleep in moments. Once she was breathing steady, Smoke reached into his duster. He pulled out the folded papers he'd taken from Brand Holleran's safe while the world was on fire. He smoothed the main page out in the flickering light. It was a ledger, just like the one in the general store. But this one didn't track barrels of nails or sacks of flour. It tracked human lives. There were names, dates, and locations. A list of children. He found her entry near the middle. Asset Ductuor 17. Source: Vein, E. Acquisition cost: 1 cleared debt. But then he kept reading. His blood ran cold. Her name wasn't the only one. There were dozens of children, listed like cattle, with notes on their acquisition and their final disposition. Some were kept for labor. Others had a different word next to their name. Sold. And a destination. A mining town in the north. A rail baron in the east. He was staring at the blueprint of a monstrous network of human trafficking, run by a man who saw children as nothing more than a commodity. By the 3rd day, the number of riders hunting them had doubled. Smoke saw their dust trails from a high ridge, no longer moving as a single group, but spreading out, a net closing in. These weren't just ranch hands. These were professionals, paid well to ensure that Brand Holleran's secrets stayed buried. He looked at Mercy, who was watching the dust trails too, her small face grim. He knew they couldn't outrun them forever. Running was a temporary solution. Running meant Halloran won. He made a decision, a hard one. They had to go back, not south, to the fire. They had to go north, back to Perdition Creek, back to the woman who started it all, back to Elra. The ride north was a desperate, 4-day race against time and Halloran's closing net. Smoke pushed them hard, moving mostly at night, navigating by the stars he knew so well. He stole 2 fresh horses from a prospector's unguarded camp, one for himself, and a small, sturdy gray mare for Mercy. She didn't talk much, but she watched him with an intensity that unnerved him. She started to mimic him, the way he checked the cinch on his saddle, the way he scanned the horizon before they broke cover. On the 5th night, she built the small campfire herself, her movements a perfect copy of his. She was a survivor. She was her mother's daughter. They reached the ridge overlooking Perdition Creek just as the sun was breaking, streaking the sky with veins of orange and gold. Mercy reined in her little mare and just stared down at the cluster of buildings nestled in the valley. Will she know who I am?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Smoke looked from the town to the little girl beside him, this fierce, fragile ghost he'd pulled from the flames. "She'll feel you," he said. "That's all that matters." They rode down the slope slowly, not as fugitives, but as deliverers of a truth the town had tried to murder. Perdition Creek was just as he'd left it, dusty, silent, afraid. But word of a fire down south, a fire at Halloran's Ridge, had a way of traveling on the wind. As they rode down the main street, curtains twitched. Doors opened a crack. Eyes watched them pass. By the time they reached the chapel at the end of the road, Elra was already there. She pushed the door open and stepped out onto the porch, looking as if she had been standing right there, waiting, for 7 long years. She saw the girl on the gray mare. Her hand flew to her mouth. A sound, a broken, strangled gasp escaped her lips. And then her legs gave out, and she sank to her knees in the dust, her arms held open wide. Mercy didn't cry. She slid off her horse and walked forward, her small boots making puffs in the dirt. She stopped right in front of the kneeling woman. And then she spoke the one word that healed the world. "Mama." Inside the dusty chapel, mother and daughter clung to each other, a decade of stolen time dissolving in a flood of silent tears. Smoke stood in the doorway, a guardian at the threshold, giving them the moment that had been bought with so much pain. And then he heard it, the sound he'd been expecting. Hoofbeats, steady, confident. Riders coming into town. But this time, he didn't turn to run. He stepped out of the chapel's shadow, back into the harsh sunlight, into the middle of the dusty street. He turned to face them. They weren't taking her again. Not while he was still breathing. Not while Smoke still remembered what a name was worth. The road back to Perdition Creek had been more than just a trail. It was the closing of a circle. Smoke had ridden countless roads in his life, most of them leading away from something, away from a memory, away from a name on a wanted poster. But this road, this one led towards something. It carried the weight of a truth that had been buried alive, and truths like that have a way of clawing their way back into the light. Mercy rode beside him, no longer a frightened passenger, but a partner in this strange, desperate journey. The little gray mare moved with a steady gait, as if it understood the importance of its cargo. There was a new light in Mercy's eyes, a hardness that hadn't been there before, the look of a child who had been forced to grow up in the space of a single fiery night. She didn't have to ask where they were going. The road itself seemed to pull them northward, back to the beginning, back to the source of the wound. They crested the final ridge as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. Below them, nestled in the valley's cradle, lay Perdition Creek. It looked smaller from up here, more fragile, a collection of tired buildings slouching under the immense, indifferent sky. Smoke pulled his horse to a halt, his eyes scanning the town. Nothing seemed to have changed. The dust still coated every surface. The silence was still the loudest thing about the place. But it wasn't the town that held his attention. It was the chapel, its crooked bell tower, a dark silhouette against the bleeding sky. He nudged his horse forward, and Mercy followed without a word. As they descended into the valley, he felt the town wake up. A curtain twitched in a window. A face appeared and then vanished. On every porch, people stepped out of the shadows, their expressions a mixture of fear and a dawning terrible hope. News of the fire at Holleran's Ridge had arrived before they did, a rumor that had set the town on edge. When Smoke and the small girl on the gray mare appeared, the rumor took flesh. They knew. By the time they reached the chapel steps, the street was lined with silent spectators. Smoke swung down from his horse first. He turned to help Mercy, but she was already sliding to the ground, her boots landing with a soft thud. The chapel door creaked open before she could take a single step, and Elra was there. She was framed in the dark doorway, wearing the same threadbare shawl, her face etched with years of unshed tears. But her eyes were different. The wild, trapped look was gone. In its place was a fierce, desperate hunger. For a long, stretched-out moment, the entire town held its breath. The world seemed to stop spinning. And then, a single word, spoken in a child's clear voice, shattered the silence. "Mama." The word was a key, unlocking a door that had been sealed for 7 years. Elra didn't scream. She didn't cry out. She simply fell to her knees in the dirt, her body collapsing as if the strings holding her together had finally been cut. Her arms opened, a silent invitation. A prayer answered. Mercy ran. The girl buried her head in her mother's chest, and Elra's arms closed around her, holding on as if she could physically fuse their bodies back together to make up for every stolen night, every missed milestone. Smoke turned his back, giving them their moment, a sacred space in the middle of a profane world. He walked a few paces into the street, listening to the sound of a mother's quiet, broken sobs, the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. And then he heard the other sound. Hoofbeats, 4 riders, moving with a purpose that had nothing to do with curiosity. They were trained, flanking, surrounding. Smoke turned. They came from the east, out of the setting sun, 4 dark figures against the glare. They wore long dusters, their faces hidden in shadow. One had a sheriff's badge pinned crookedly to his chest. Another had a jagged scar that ran from his ear down into his collar. They didn't shout. They didn't threaten. They just dismounted with a slow, deliberate menace. A tall, lean man with eyes like rusted nails stepped forward, a piece of folded paper in his hand. "We've come for the girl." Smoke didn't move. The man held up the paper. It had an official-looking seal. "She's under protective retrieval, property of the estate of Josiah Teller. This town's law ends where Teller land begins." Smoke's voice was dangerously quiet. "Teller's been dead for 10 years. His brother ain't," the man sneered, "and the claim is ironclad." Behind him, Elra was on her feet now, her arm a steel band around Mercy's shoulders. Her voice, rough from disuse, rang out across the street. "You're not taking her." The man with the nail eyes barely glanced at her. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this is no longer your choice." "She is my daughter." Elra's voice was a raw cry. "The paper says otherwise." Smoke took a step forward, placing himself between the men and the chapel steps. "What's her name?" he asked, his voice soft. The man blinked, thrown by the question. "What? It don't matter." Smoke's eyes narrowed. "Say her name." The man hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty on his hard face. "She's..." She's the girl. That's all that matters." "It matters to me," Smoke said, his voice dropping even lower. "It matters to her mother. Say her name." The man didn't answer. His hand drifted down, his fingers spreading over the butt of his pistol. Smoke's rifle was off his back and in his hands before the man's fingers had even tightened. The wind stopped. Time stopped. The street was caught in a perfect, terrible silence. The other men went for their guns. Smoke didn't shoot first, but he didn't shoot second either. The quiet street exploded into a hurricane of sound and fire. Thunder rolled across Perdition Creek. The man with the nail eyes crumpled to the ground, a look of stunned surprise on his face. A second man fell backwards, his duster flying open. The third, the one with the scar, staggered behind a water trough, firing blindly. Smoke moved with an eerie, lethal grace, not a man but a force of nature. Precise, efficient, final. The last man, the one with the crooked badge, dropped his gun and ran, disappearing into the alleyways like the coward he was. Smoke didn't give chase. He lowered the rifle and turned back to the chapel. Mercy stood on the steps, her eyes wide, her small fists clenched at her sides. Elra didn't weep. She simply walked down the steps, took Mercy's hand, and stood beside Smoke. That night, they didn't call the law. They were the law. With the help of the old terrified undertaker, they buried the bodies in the same unmarked patch of ground where Mercy's empty box was supposed to be. And then they told the town the truth, the whole truth. When the real law, a federal marshal with honest eyes, finally rode in weeks later, the story was already set in stone. The town spoke with one voice. Witnesses came forward, papers were filed. Smoke stood before the county clerk in a town 2 days' ride away. He wore the same dusty coat, the same hat. The clerk squinted at the formal request he'd filed. "You want to adopt the girl? What's your name, son?" Smoke looked at Elra and Mercy, who were waiting by the door. "Hattok," he said, the name feeling strange on his tongue. Jedediah Hattok. He was no longer a drifter. He was a father. The clerk shrugged and slammed his stamp down on the paper. The line read, "Mercy Elra Hattok." The story didn't end there. It was a new beginning. Perdition Creek began to change. People started looking each other in the eye again. They started talking, not in whispers, but in full voices. Smoke built a new fence around Elra's land. He repaired the roof of her shack. Mercy started lessons in the chapel, taught by a mother whose voice had returned, stronger and clearer than ever before. Every Sunday, the chapel bell rang out across the valley, a sound of defiance and hope. And every night, a man who had forgotten how to sleep would sit on the porch and watch the stars come out, a peace settling in his heart that he never thought he'd deserve. He hadn't just saved a child. She and her mother had saved him. They say the frontier has no memory, that the wind blows the stories away like so much dust. But not this one. Not the story of a girl named Mercy and the man who gave her back her name. Because sometimes truth doesn't come riding in like a cavalry charge. Sometimes it comes quiet and slow, a whisper that refuses to die. And sometimes the greatest justice isn't found in a courtroom, but in the fierce, unrelenting belief in a child's right to her own life. If you believe some truths are worth fighting for, hit that subscribe button, because there are more shadows out there that need the light.